Ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, please join me in welcoming Dr. George Nicholas back to the stage. Masicho.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to begin by thanking the elders, the community members, the chiefs for allowing me into their territory, and of course the conference organizers for putting together such a fantastic gathering. Thank you very much. I'm not an expert in traditional knowledge. Those folks that I've mentioned at the beginning are. I'm an archaeologist, an anthropologist, an observer, a facilitator. So I'm coming to look at this from a particular direction. In part as an academic, I'm wearing my tribal regalia, as you see. But also as someone who's been working closely with Indigenous peoples and have sought to use my knowledge of the world to help them in many different ways, as well as to help my colleagues understand some of the issues that are unfolding. And we're here today to talk about oral histories, traditional knowledge, and all of these things that are so central to the worldview, the well-being, in fact, the lives of many Indigenous peoples in this region and in other parts of the world. If we want to be formal about it, we can define traditional knowledge in the usual academic sense, and I'll just read you one brief definition. Traditional knowledge can be defined as a collective body of knowledge, experience, epistemology, origin stories, traditions, and values held by societies that explain, record, and perpetuate their relationship with the world and everything in it. I mean, that sort of captures everything, but I think a more satisfying description, this is the kind of description you get from elders, is more along the lines of, it's all that we know, it's all that we are. Traditional knowledge has been garnering a lot of attention from academics and many others for some time, but it's becoming more and more a topic of discussion and sometimes of debate. Now, of course, Indigenous peoples have not had to talk about traditional knowledge. In fact, the only reason it's quote-unquote traditional is in comparison to something else. So it's always been just knowledge. And one thing that we need to be careful of is that this knowledge, traditional knowledge, does not have to be validated in any kind of scientific way. It is a valid system of knowledge in the same way that Western knowledge, Western science is a validated system of understanding things. Now, where things get interesting is along these lines that archaeologists and anthropologists and others have been turning to traditional knowledge for a long time to help us understand how we can look at the world over vast time periods and distances and so on. So in other words, traditional knowledge can be useful to us as scholars to help us test, to help us interpret what it is we find or what it is we want to know. And we're also seeing increasingly that climatologists and geologists and so on are also turning to traditional knowledge for reasons like that, as you see from a recent article from the journal Climate Change, where here in the title it acknowledges Inuit knowledge as a way to help them understand ice flows and ice extent during the winter. But there are also many other scientific journal articles and so on that use Indigenous knowledge without acknowledging that. And in fact, some of my colleagues who work closely with Indigenous peoples actually co-author with them. And you don't see any kind of co-authorship here. And this brings us also to another important aspect of the intersection of Western science with Indigenous heritage. And that is when traditional knowledge agrees with what archaeologists and anthropologists are seeking to discover or test and so on, it's accepted. It is seen as a valuable and valid source of information. But when there is disagreement, when archaeological evidence says one thing and oral traditions say something else, then quote unquote the validity of oral histories are questioned. And this is something that we really want to be careful of. Again, coming back to this idea of we don't need to validate this stuff to make it legitimate. My presentation is looking at some of these issues very, very broadly. I wanted to reach out in a largely non-academic way to connect with the elders, community members, and so on here. And if you want to read my academic writing, you can go read it. That's what today is not for that. So I want to look at the intersection or not between Western and Indigenous knowledge and science and so on to start with. And then I also want to look at some of the intellectual property issues that may come into play here. So I'd like to start with just some very general observations, something that touches on what I was speaking on yesterday morning. And this is looking at the notion of evidence. Now, if you're familiar with the Delgamuukw decision, it had gone through a long series of court hearings and so on. And this is a cartoon that Don Monet created relating to the first decision with Judge McEachran. And it's titled The Law versus Ayuk, Written versus Oral History. And on the left side, you see all of that scientific evidence, the maps, the statistics, and all of the numbers and so on that record the Crown's and support the Crown's argument. And on the right, you have the Gitsen-Wet'suwet'en oral histories and traditional knowledge and so on, that are stories, that are not based on material evidence, they're based on other forms of evidence. I would argue, and I think all of us here would, that these are separate but equal forms of knowledge. They're both ways of knowing the world, and each tells us something different from the other. In many cases, sometimes they tell us the same thing. And if we want to understand this relationship between Western science and Indigenous science, Indigenous knowledge, we have to ensure that we know at least the real foundational elements of both. And here I'm giving you a gross generalization that in the Western world, we tend to put things into categories. It's a Cartesian view of the world. And so there is all of these dichotomies, all of these opposites, nature versus culture, the natural realm versus the supernatural realm, and on and on and on. And time is generally viewed as linear. It's non-repeating. It's time as an arrow. And for Indigenous peoples, again, a gross generalization, those dichotomies tend not to exist, that all of these things fold into each other. And so you have ancestral spirits in this room, not somewhere that you have to reach through a seance or through some sort of special process. And here time is viewed as circular. Now, this is hugely important when it comes to explaining why archaeologists and others and Indigenous peoples are not always connecting in terms of why should we preserve this site versus that site, or how can we preserve this rock, the spiritual place, because it has no artifacts, it has no scientific evidence that this was used as how the Indigenous people say it was. So there's some real challenges here that we need to be familiar with, because this is, I think, really the key to moving forward in a more productive conversation. Now, earlier I threw in the phrase Indigenous science, and Indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, is not simply based on what the Creator, what spirits tell us. It's based on observation, experimentation, interpretation, many of the same techniques that folks in white lab coats use to understand the world. And there are topics that there is significant overlap with. In fact, if we're talking about traditional knowledge, you know how folks have knowledge of the caribou and where they're going. In other words, detailed knowledge of their biology. And one of the best known areas where the scientific aspects of traditional knowledge is most appreciated is with what's known as traditional ecological knowledge. And this refers to the principles and protocols that communities have to not only understand the connections between people and the landscape and the plants and animals and ancestral beings and supernatural forces that are there, but also how they perpetuate those connections, those relationships well into the future. And this is a really important avenue to understanding from the perspective of scientists or Western scholars, the legitimacy of, and again, I use these terms very carefully, the legitimacy of Indigenous observation, Indigenous science. And if you want to have a good entry point, read the work of Nancy Turner. She has just come out with this a 2-volume compendium. It's a masterwork of hers, Ancient Pathways, Ancestral Knowledge. And if you open up the cover, you will find page after page after page after page of acknowledgments of all of the elders and community members. And Nancy has also often co-written, co-authored books and articles with these folks. So what I want to do now in looking at this relationship between science and culture and Indigenous values and so on is to look at, first of all, a set of examples where there seems to be some sort of connection between Western and Indigenous knowledge. And then to move on to some examples where that connection is not really there in an obvious way, or perhaps not at all. So I want to just start with 3 examples. And here to move into far eastern Canada with the Abenaki. And they have stories of a transformer known as Glooskap. And he went around setting the world right, making the land as it is at one location. And I'll just read this to you in case you can't see it in the back. In cutting up a beaver dam at Kikshintenko, a small portion of the earth floated away, and Glooskap changed it into a moose and set his dogs on it. The moose took it back to the bay and made off, whereupon Glooskap turned him back into a land and made him an island, and so on. So here you have a story of how things came to be. But thinking back on that lack of dichotomies in Indigenous perspectives, that those beings are still there right now for many Abenaki. So it's one thing as an ethnographer, an anthropologist, a storyteller from the outside to record these stories. They're interesting, they really shed light into the Abenaki way of life. But there's also a number of archaeologists who are looking at the apparent correlations between some of these Glooskap transformation places in the stories and where stone for making tools was found. And there is, in fact, a very interesting correlation. So here we have something that's very interesting going on between what we can know through science and what we can know through Indigenous traditions and so on. That is, there is a connection of some sort. Here's a second example from British Columbia. And this involves what have become known as clam gardens. Now, there is a record of these in many of the First Nations communities who lived along the coast. But that information was really not widely shared. And some years ago, a geomorphologist was doing some work from doing aerial surveys, and he noted these very interesting modified parts of the landscape. And he reported to the Archaeological Survey or the BC Archaeology branch. And here you see a portion of them at high tide, so that is the outside portion of these clam gardens. And the archaeology branch said, oh, those are fish traps. And it's only after further conversations with elders and so on that archaeologists got in there and they saw that these were constructions that were made to provide an ideal habitat for clams. So in other words, you are cultivating, if you want to use that word, clams. And you're able there to give them an ideal habitat and you're able to maximize the return and so on. And so this is something that the archaeologists didn't first accept until the community members and others really pushed them to take a closer look. And a third example concerns the interior of British Columbia, but also larger areas of the plateau. And this concerns balsam root, which was perhaps the most important food source for plateau peoples in terms of a source of carbohydrates. But it was also balsam root and many other plants were used for medicinal purposes. And a colleague of mine, Kelly Bannister, who's an ethnobotanist, conducted a PhD dissertation research on balsam root and on the phytochemical properties. And this is a list of the various types of plants used by the Secwepemc and the Klapemc and others. And in looking at balsamine in particular, but what you see here is that there's a plant for every purpose. What Bannister found was that some of these plants have one can verify the effectiveness from a scientific perspective, the effectiveness of these having antimicrobial properties and so on. So here you have, a so-called verification of the effectiveness of these plants. So those are three examples where there is, that connection between, Western and Indigenous knowledge. But there are also examples where they seem to be going off in different directions. And here's one. And this deals with the Eastern Cree and what's known as the Natwa bones. And my colleague David Denton has worked for decades, has devoted himself for working with the Cree. And they had one story about the Natwa, which are likely invading Iroquois warriors coming into their territory. And there was one event in their oral history where the Cree put an end to that warrior party. And the place where that happened, where the Natwa bones would have remained, have always been known to the Cree. And so at one point, Denton is working with elders, and they say, let's go, find this place using archaeology. And they went, and they couldn't find it. They dug, the usual archaeological test pits, and no bones. So what does this mean? Did the elder misremember the place? Or did the bones simply disintegrate in the acidic soils of the Northeast? Or does that story have no factual basis? And one of the things that Denton talks about is that knowledge is always contextualized. Sometimes that knowledge requires certain kinds of other knowledge to make it complete. And it's like a treasure map where you may have only certain clues, and some elders have been given some of those clues and others. And through the challenges that Indigenous peoples have faced through colonialism, there are big gaps in that knowledge because some elders never passed on certain parts of that story. But in any case, here's an example where there is not a congruence. Here's another example from British Columbia in the Stein River Valley, where there are some of the most magnificent pictographs, rock paintings that are in the region. And one Niklamic elder visited these sites with an anthropologist and a filmmaker, and she went around and to images like these rock art panels, she told them the story of what they represent. And this is a hunter's vision quest, and he was gone for so many days, and this happened to him, and so on. York's book really captured everyone's attention. This is wonderful, an elder recounting her story. But then, some people, archaeologists, of course, say, how do you know this when these images may be hundreds, if not thousands of years old? And when that hunter painting his vision quest, how would Annie, so many years later, know what that hunter was doing? Now, of course, there could be, common symbols that others can interpret. And Annie may only be able to tell us, a small part of the larger story. But for Annie, or for others, they say, we don't need to tell you how we know this. We just know it. And so here's an example of this disconnect between, scientific evidence and, these images and stories that go with them. For the Navajo of the American Southwest, according to scientific information and according to the stories of their neighbors, that the Navajos really have only been around for 700, 800, 1,000 years at most. So you've got a very different story between science and the Navajo, or the Navajo and the Hopi, and so on. And one would think, well, let's get some DNA and use this to solve some of the questions in terms of Navajo origins and so on. But the story is complicated by such things as Apache raiding and Navajo women being taken away, and so the DNA evidence is really ambiguous, as is the connection between the archaeological evidence and these other forms of evidence. But This example shows you that there can be strong disagreement between the origin stories of neighboring First Nations, not just between the archaeologists and the indigenous groups. And then one more example, and this is drawn from my own fieldwork in Kamloops with the Secwepemc. And about 20 years ago, I was excavating a site with my students, most of whom were Secwepemc folks. And some elders came by, and they were watching us for an hour or two. And we were telling what we were doing in terms of how the plateau pit house tradition, where people had lived in these semi-subterranean houses along the rivers, and their diet was largely based on salmon and so on, up until 5,000, or for the last 5,000 years or so. And before that, they had a less restricted way of life and a strong reliance on elk and deer and so on. And after I explained all of this, one of the elders turned to me and he said, "Listen, Sonny," or words to that effect. I was a Sonny then. He said, "That's not right, because my ancestors have always lived in pit houses." And he was absolutely convinced of that history of him, of his family, of his people. And I certainly respect that. But one of the interesting things here is that for a long time, indigenous peoples have objected to the term prehistory because they read it as people without a history. And that's not how archaeologists mean it, by the way. And they claim that, that use of the term prehistory makes them static, makes them unchanging and very restricted in their ability to adapt to change and so on. But the irony here is that Secwepemc elder had actually painted himself into the corner of being, wed to a very static, non-changing, very conservative way of life, when if you look at the broader history of the Secwepemc and their ancestors, they were doing some remarkable things in adapting to climate change and changes on the landscape and so on. So we have these tensions that run through the intersection of indigenous and other ways of knowing things. And here's an interesting question. And on the one hand, there's a really easy answer. Is the lack of agreement between these knowledge systems really a problem? Well, on the one hand, of course it is, and that's in fact part of the reason we're all here today, is to share our knowledge, share our concerns about the loss of traditional knowledge, the challenges to traditional knowledges, as well as innovative ways to preserve and protect and promote that knowledge. So that's the easy answer. The other answer is only a sort of. While I fully agree, and I'm very concerned about threats to indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, I think that being between these two different knowledge systems can also be a really healthy and invigorating thing because it forces us to respond to changing circumstances. We can't go back in time. We can't go back to a time when the Dene didn't have to worry about protecting their intellectual property, their material culture, their land, and so on. So here is a Mi'kmaq elder, Merdina Marshall, who's speaking of some of the issues that I'm alluding to. And the first is, she writes, she stated, "You believe in proof, we believe in oral traditions. We need to let those two work together to reach a common ground." And I strongly agree with that, because we can't go back, so how do we move forward? And how do we move forward together? But she also points out about how satisfied she has always been with her knowledge. She says, "For me, I did not need archaeology or anthropology or geology to prove where I came from. My oral traditions, which are part of my everyday life, told me so a long time ago." And again, I deeply respect that, the fact that that person knows and they have the sense of knowledge that propels them forward. Here's a statement, and I know I'm going to embarrass Kelsey, who's one of our graduate fellows in the workshop here a couple of days ago. And in working with the local First Nation with the Caribou Project, she writes this about exploring ways in which indigenous knowledge and scientific approaches can be linked, not integrated. This distinction implies that neither knowledge system is being enveloped by the other, but they're working in tandem, complementing one another. And what I found so invigorating about the graduate fellow workshop on Friday was that those people have a really good sense of the issues that are out there regarding traditional knowledge in all of its many different forms, the great challenges, but also the great opportunities. And they are going to be the next generation of scholars. Some of them are First Nations, some of them are white, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where they go in the next 10, 20 years and so on. And there's another aspect to why being caught between these systems is so valuable. And this is a statement from a very well-known archaeologist, Bruce Trigger, Canadian archaeologist, who writes this: by contradicting accepting interpretations of the past, these ideas stimulated research that tested both old and new ideas. The greatest obstacle to making progress in archaeology is intellectual complacency. Without the ability to imagine alternative explanation, archaeology languishes. And this is one of the great things that I think archaeologists and others listening to indigenous peoples and people in other cultures, indigenous or not, that we can learn how they see the world, what's valuable to them, and where their ideas, where their knowledge disagrees with us. We shouldn't discount that knowledge. We should delve deeper into it, to the degree that they're willing to share information, to rethink how we are thinking about the world. And I think that that will take us forward in the same way that Bruce Trigger is suggesting here. So what I've done so far is to speak with some generalities about the nature of these different ways of knowing and some of the challenges that are there when there is lack of agreement, some of the opportunities to make connections where there are degrees of agreement. Traditional knowledge is intellectual property. And this is, I think, something we need to pay a lot of attention to. Well, what's intellectual property? It's basically creations of the mind. It's what people think. It could take the form of songs and stories and technological innovations and many, many other aspects of this. And traditional knowledge is intellectual property. I mean, there's no question about that. I mean, this is part of a definition of Indigenous knowledge by my colleague, who's an Abenaki, Marge Bruchak. And she's writing of oral narratives and cosmological observations, including the Northern Lights, techniques for planting, understanding the local ecosystems, and much, much more. And this is all traditional knowledge, but it's also intellectual property. And indigenous intellectual property, indigenous material culture has been widely sought as a source of entertainment and research and marketing and clothing and so on, as I mentioned yesterday. And if we had time, I could show you literally 1,000 examples, some of which are very clever, some of which are really, really disturbing. If you look at the bottom, everyone knows the giant heads of Easter Island, the moai. Well, you could buy a tissue box where you pull out the tissue from the nostrils. Now, one could say, well, that's really clever, it's fun, and so on. What do the Easter Islanders think of this? If those images are sacred to them, this is something that can, obviously cause harm and discomfort. And the Inukshuk, that you can find 100 different varieties of Inukshuk products, which on the one hand, you could say, well, it honors, Inuit. On the other hand, it makes what was once something special commonplace, and it loses some of its value. When we're looking at the appropriation and commodification and exploitation of indigenous heritage, it deals not only with the material, stuff, but with the intellectual property. And this can cause spiritual harm, economic harm, and other kinds of harms. So what do we do about it? Well, there's not much we can do from a Western perspective, because how intellectual property is defined in the Western world is distinct from that of indigenous peoples. And here you see some of the key attributes of Western intellectual property. It's based on property values and rights. It's based on things, things that could be measured and so on. there are very limited types of ownership. And usually it's the individual's ownership of the patent or the company's ownership of the patent. And where intellectual property is infringed, it's largely measured in terms of economic loss. And there are ways that we protect intellectual property in the West. But copyrights, patents, trademarks, industrial designs, trade secrecy are all directed to those attributes that I just mentioned. Indigenous intellectual property is significantly different because it's not based on things, it's based on relations and responsibilities that people have to those things, but especially to other people. And what is important too, it's not so much individual rights as communal rights. And again, the kinds of harms that may result. So how do we protect it? How do we protect traditional knowledge and indigenous intellectual property? It's very difficult. And it's not only difficult legally, it's difficult from a cultural perspective. And if you recall my talking about Kelly Bannister's balsam root study, she did the study with the permission of the Secwepemc Cultural Education Society, and she had a memorandum of agreement that stated that they would own all the copyrights of her work, not the biological lab in which she was based, because normally the lab owns or the university owns the result of scholars' work that's under their auspices. And there was also a moratorium on the chemistry chapters. I think it was a 5-year moratorium to allow the Secwepemc the opportunity to explore the development of certain medicinal aspects of balsam root coming out of Bannister's work. And that didn't happen for a number of reasons. But this speaks to one of the challenges, and that is that how can you patent, how can you trademark the knowledge of one indigenous group when others in that region may have the same knowledge and have chosen not to or are unable to have legal protection for these medicinal properties or some other kind of intellectual property and accomplishments we're dealing with. So things get really, really complicated. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not giving you any legal advice, but there's some great literature out there that explores the complex aspects of indigenous intellectual property. But there are two approaches that are really valuable and we need to strongly promote. One is policies and protocols, which may be voluntary, but you can work with policymakers at the local or federal or national government to get them aware and get them listening to your concerns. And one great example of what's going on here is with the Gwich'in Tribal Council, with their traditional knowledge policy. The other approach is through public education. And this includes not only reaching out to the public at large who are consumers and are seeking to use or benefit from someone else's knowledge, as well as from people who are affected and they want to know what their rights are. A few years ago, I was at a conference, a Pekani man came and he said, someone came and they videotaped our Sundance and they trademarked it. And he was so upset of what he saw was a real insult and real damage to him. And of course, no one can patent, so no one can trademark a video of someone else's thing. So he simply wasn't aware of what his legal rights were or what others could or could not do. So there are a number of approaches. The way that I've approached this is through the Intellectual Property Issues and Cultural Heritage Program. And we are working around the world. Our team consists of over 50 scholars, including archaeologists, anthropologists, ethicists, museum specialists, lawyers, and so on. We're working with many indigenous groups as partners. And in fact, just to identify our northern partners, whom we are so appreciative of, these are the folks who are dealing with these issues of intellectual property, traditional knowledge, and much, much more here in the north. This project is directed to accomplishing 4 things. First of all, to see what's going on regarding intellectual property concerns and approaches and what's working well and what's not. The second is to analyze these examples of where we're seeing a problem emerge regarding someone's cultural heritage and Third is to use all this information to help us understand good ways to go. What are good practices? Not best practices, because they're never best practices. There's always just good practices. And finally, to use all this knowledge to start informing policymakers, as well as to get this information in the hands of those who can really benefit, that is, communities. So we have 15 community-based projects around the world, with the Inuvialuit, for example, and the repatriation of their intellectual property that is part and parcel of objects in a museum. With the Sanilac petroglyphs, co-management of important heritage places to them. With the Moriori, developing a cultural database. And I'll mention now that both the Inuvialuit and the Moriori final community-based reports are on our website. And they're really rich compendium, and I strongly, if you're interested in these issues, I strongly encourage you to check them out. And all of the final reports of our projects will be there in coming months. Working in Nunavut with the Avatak Cultural Institute, and there the concern is how do you protect language while also promoting and hopefully benefiting from cultural tourism. Working in Kyrgyzstan with the local Kyrgyz who are trying to promote, in fact, celebrate their culture through cultural tourism, while also ensuring that their information is not lost in some way, it's not abused by others. Working with Yukon First Nations, and this is, helping them to, or just supporting them, we're not really helping them, they know what they're doing. Working out policies for more effective government-to-government relations in support of their values, their needs. Working with the Manning River community in South Australia. And here's an opportunity that they've taken at a very important cultural site known as Not Not to correct all of the misinformation about their heritage that's already out there on the web or in books and so on. And they're using this as an opportunity to tell their own story and to not to use that to replace the archaeological or scientific story of what went on here, but to complement it, to extend it. Working with the Secwepemc in interior British Columbia. And here they've taken the approach that what if the Secwepemc had full control over their heritage, their land, and so on? What would that look like? And this is a really interesting approach because it forces a kind of discussion that one normally doesn't entertain. Where you're sort of waiting for permission from the government to see and then figure out what happens. They are moving forward regardless of what the government is saying. And they've also been working with the Chilcotin, who recently were part of a major, absolutely astounding decision by the Supreme Court of Canada, which changed consultation to consent. And that is going to have huge implications, and the Secwepemc team has been working in that regard. And then other projects we have with the Ainu of northern Japan, the indigenous peoples of northern Japan, as well as the San of Botswana and southern Africa. If you go to our website, you'll find one of the initiatives we're supporting is on licensing of traditional knowledge. And this is where groups can identify where they want to share information, what kind of licensing do they put on it? So there's a lot of information. Go to our website. You could sign up for our monthly digest and get our newsletter. We have, at this point, I think 45 videos going on, 10 podcasts, and all sorts of other information that might be useful to you, where you're hearing it not from me, but from the community members. Indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, provides archaeologists and anthropologists a chance to not only test our ideas, as we've always been doing, but to be challenged in how we're thinking about things. And this is, I think, a really interesting opportunity that we have for those who are willing to take that challenge. And the result is, I think, Western science can benefit, Western knowledge can benefit. And for their part, indigenous peoples have the opportunity to examine what the archaeologists are saying about their histories, or the anthropologists are saying about their lives today. But they can be as selective as archaeologists and others. in seeing what works for them. You know, what makes sense to them and not bothering about what doesn't work. And I think one important way to visualize where we're at here in terms of this connection between Western and Indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, whatever we want to call these things, is this notion of not integrating them, but respecting them as full and equal partners. And one effective way to think of this is as a wampum belt. And for Northeastern peoples, they used wampum belts like this. These are made out of shells. These represent a legal contract. They represent a promissory note. And these also represent a living entity. A wampum belt is alive. And for the Haudenosaunee, they have a wampum belt, very important to them, called the two-row wampum. And you're seeing an example of one similar to it. And my colleague, March Bruchak, whom I mentioned earlier in Abenaki, writes this in reference to the Haudenosaunee wampum. This diplomatic tradition invites two separate cultures to coexist side by side without undue influence with one another, which parallels the efforts to integrate Western science and Indigenous knowledge. Sometimes it will be useful, sometimes not. But both groups need to have control over that interpretation. Thank you.
Dr. George Nicholas, round of applause, please. Great job, George.